Hello there, Grumpy Old Fart here. I'm doing an advanced Dungeons and Dragons story. It's actually more of an advice thing for new dungeon masters. I've seen on Facebook in the groups that I'm in a lot of, and on MeWe too, by the way, a lot of new game masters are asking for advice about certain things, and we need all the dungeon masters we can get, and we need all the players we can get. So, amen. God bless you all. Okay, I've been running Advanced Dungeons and Dragons for over 40 years, and I'm putting these videos out because I hope it helps people to run better games. Most players are pretty logical minded, so you have to keep that in mind when you're running the games. Now, that being said, this particular one is on governments. Check out my video, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Stories In-Game Politics. Okay, that's going to tell you a lot of good information as well. This particular one is on the different specific governments. Now, the governmental system of any land can grant some really great opportunities for adventure. So as a dungeon master, you have to put a lot of thought into what kind of government the area is under for your that you're running your adventure in. Your player characters can find all kinds of things to do working for or against the local government. If it's a good, just government and they're offering bounties for good things, you have them work for them. Hell yeah, no problem there. By the same token, on the flip side, if it's an oppressive regime that's, you know, a police state for whatever reason, they're the evil king is taxing everybody to death and blah 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 blah. Yeah, you can also work to overthrow that. So, you know, whichever way you want to do it is fine. There's lots of different things you can do. On page 89 of the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons DM's Guide, there is a wonderful list of different governmental forms, and this is a very abbreviated list. It gives the name and a short description. Any of them could be ideal for a medieval fantasy. Usually, when we think of a medieval fantasy, it's more of a feudal system, meaning it's like a big pyramid. You know, the king controls a few guys here who control a bunch of guys under them, who control a bunch of guys under them, blah, blah, blah. It's like a big pyramid scheme. But before you decide which system you want to use, I recommend a lot of research into which one you want to do, because they all have pluses and minuses, pros and cons. One thing you have to understand is in any medieval setting, corruption is prevalent. It is very, very prevalent in most of them. The only one I can think of, the minimal amount of corruption would be in a militocracy. And what that means is the military runs the government. Okay. Now, when you have a bureaucracy running a government that has a strong military, you can have a military hierarchy with lots of corruption in it. But when you have the military actually running the government, there's a lot less corruption per se. And the reason being is the military itself has checks and balances. For example, the logistics lines, the different costs, the expenditures, they all have to add up. If they don't, somebody has to answer for that. Military is very, very efficient at that. When you have a bureaucracy running the government, that's where your gray area comes in, and your upper echelon military, maybe their pencils aren't quite so sharp, and that's where you get the corruption there. And that happens at a lot of militaries around our modern world, because the bureaucracy is running the government, and there's a lot of gray area where people can be corrupt. If it's a pure militocracy, those gray areas go away. You can still have corruption, but it's not going to be near as much as a bureaucracy running the military. You see what I'm saying? There's a difference there. But one thing you have to understand as far as a medieval setting, you have to remember the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. It's that simple, okay? Most regimes in fantasy settings maintain what's called a balance of force. There's a lot of campaigns out there where a player can buy just about anything, and I'm usually pretty lax about that unless I have a major campaign underway, in which case, then I take this into account. But for the most part, this isn't going to be a factor. But if you want to maintain the realism of a medieval regime, you have to take this into account, the balance of force. Civilians who cannot have weapons or training are no threat to the regime. So the way you keep peasants from uprising is you don't let them have weapons, and you don't let them learn how to use them. Okay? Untrained peasants are easy to beat by a trained army, even if there are a lot more peasants. In Okinawa and in several other places in the world, the peasants weren't allowed to have weapons. So they adapted martial arts, unarmed fighting techniques. Te, meaning hand, was then later modified into karate, empty hand. And then, of course, they modified that into using farm implements as weapons. For those of you who like the 70s Bruce Lee movies and all that, I love them. They're great. Bruce Lee's one of the greatest. He liked the nunchucks. That's a wheat thresher. Okay? It's also considered a pretty damn good flail. They adapted farm implements because they weren't allowed to have weapons. You see what I'm saying? But untrained and unarmed civilians cannot be pressed into service. When you have the mass of people that are not trained in weapons, suddenly an invading army, you need all the people you can get, right? Well, these untrained peasants, civilians, you can't press them into service as soldiers. You can't use them to defend effectively. Now, most regimes train the most loyal people and keep weapons locked up, so that way, in case they need it, they can hand out these weapons and blah, 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 blah. And that's fine. But as far as the untrained people, the most they can be used is shock troops. Send them in a mad charge into the enemy, put them in the front ranks so that your good soldiers are behind them and can take advantage of whatever. But for the most part, most medieval regimes didn't train their peasants to use weapons. If they ever did get training, then, they were watched closely. Most feudal systems, called a feudality, are organized into a series of pyramid-shaped structures, and I mentioned this earlier. The ruler, the king, controls a number of dukes or duchesses, because, who in turn, the dukes and duchesses control a number of counts. So you have the king, 4 or 5 dukes, including one of them being the archduke, and I'll get to that in a minute. And then below him, each duke controls a number of counts, and below that, each count controls a number of barons. So it's like a big pyramid. Okay? Each baron controls an area. Each count controls a number of baronies. Each duke controls a number of counties. The most powerful duke is considered the archduke, and he controls the largest territory, which is usually around the capital, because he's usually one of the advisors to the king. And these, you didn't have to arrange it that way, but that's generally how it is. You don't have to arrange it that way. You can arrange it any way you want. If you're the dungeon master, you can set it up any way. You can even change the names. You don't have to call them dukes and counts and whatever. Okay? The opportunities for corruption are massive within this group, as the peasantry and merchants have basically little recourse. If they're taxed heavily, they're not going to report all their earnings. If the tax collector comes by and says, "So how much money did you make last year, or last week, or last month, or whatever?" If you tell him the full amount, you have to pay the full amount of taxes. So generally, they're not going to tell him the full amount. So he has to estimate. Okay, and if you're caught cheating, then the fines are a lot stiffer. Usually some jail time and blah, 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 blah. But what it boils down to is this is a reason for peasants to revolt. If the taxes are high, very oppressive government, lack of freedoms, that kind of thing. Rebellions without high-ranking benefactors are usually just peasants and merchants with whatever tools of their various trades. A blacksmith can have a hammer. A farmer has a pitchfork. That kind of thing. Mauls, axes, pitchforks, etc. And if they can't come up with something like that, they'll take a pole, sharpen it, a sharp stick. Armies are raised by enlisting these people to bolster the existing core standing armies. So when you have a bunch of these unarmed peasants, or merchants or farmers or whatever, damn bug, try getting sunglasses. When you have a military need for a large army, they'll go out and they'll say, okay, all you guys grab your stuff and come on, and they'll go. You guys get to stand in the front ranks. Well, why would they want to do that? Because they're told to. Because the Lord demanded it, which is another reason for a rebellion. Basically, here's your balance of force factor. The Lord wants to keep the peasants from revolting, from rebelling. So he keeps them unarmed and untrained. He also taxes them mercilessly. Mercilessly might be a bit of a strong word, but he taxes them heavily enough so that they can't hire mercenaries. By the same token, he sometimes may need them to help bolster his army. You see? So he's got to have some of them trained. He's got to have some of them at least able to use a weapon. So you see what I mean? There's a balance of force there. You have to balance out that. At least that's the way it was done historically. Now, that being said, this is just advice, and you can run your game any way you want. The whole point is for your players to have fun. So, if you can work out some sort of a rebellion situation where they're going to overthrow the government, or where they're going to work for the government, or whatever, you have to know what kind of government it is. That's what that boils down to. And when you run a government based in a medieval setting, you have to know how the governments were run. So do some research. There's a lot of good information in the Dungeon Master's Guide. I mentioned page 89 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. Lots of good information there. That whole section, all the pages before and after it, lots of good information there. There's some other books that you can get on medieval governments and medieval life. I would seriously recommend a lot of research there. The more research you can put into creating a viable world, the more fun your players are going to have. Okay? So that's just one aspect of that. If you don't want to have them have anything to do with the government, that's cool. You can do that. You can have them hang out in little villages, and the locals say, hey, we got this problem over here and we're willing to pay blah, blah, blah to get it done. Blah, blah. There you go. You can do that too. Nothing wrong with it. But, like I said, whatever kind of game you want to run, the whole point is to have fun. So, you folks have a good day. God bless one and all.